I'm going to put this plainly. We are living in a time where Christianity has failed to provide a vision that men are attracted to. There was a time where men sought to give up their life for our faith and way of life. But Christian men have not effectively held the line against the assault that our culture has waged on our faith and values, on our women, and on our children. And we're suffering the consequences. We have to face the facts that men are not interested in the masculinity that Christianity is currently offering. Nick Freitas is a man who is changing that. And this is what we talk about in this critically important conversation. It's time for masculine Christian men to step up and be the leaders and providers of women, children, and society that we were made to be. It's time for us to gird up and defend our women and children against the enemy seeking the destruction of our souls and way of life. I hope that this conversation not only gives you that inspiration, but the tools to become the strong man and leader that God made you to be. So Nick Freitas, thank you for joining me today.
Oh, thanks for having me on, Zach.
Yeah, Nick. So if you don't mind, could you give us a little introduction to those who may not know who you are?
Sure. So I'm a husband and father. I've been married to my wife, Tina, who's my high school sweetheart. We've been married almost 26 years now. We have three children. My oldest is 22 and married. My son is 19 and heading off to the military here in a month or so. And then my youngest daughter just turned 17. I did 11 years active duty in the military with the 82nd Airborne, the 25th Infantry, and then did a couple of tours in Iraq with 1st Special Forces Group as a SF Weapons Sergeant and SF Intel Sergeant. Got out of the military, did some work in defense contracting. Had always been somewhat interested in politics, especially especially frustrated with the way that a lot of things were going up in DC, but also at the state level. And ended up running for the Virginia House of Delegates, which is for any of your audience outside of Virginia, that's the kind of the equivalent of our House of Representatives, but for Virginia. And I've been serving there. I'm about to go into my 10th session. I've had an opportunity to serve on a variety of committees, finance, transportation, education, public safety, courts of justice, communications, technology, and innovation, which has all been very interesting. And over the last few years, started to get more involved in social media, not just talking about it from the political perspective, but talking a lot about the cultural perspective, a lot about masculinity, a lot about, what is the proper role of men in society, men in the family. And that, God's blessed that effort. We started off a few years ago with probably a couple 100,000 subscribers, in part because of my time in politics and some of the debates there. And now we've got about a little over 3 million across our various platforms, and so it's been an adventure, but that's kind of once over the world.
Yeah, that's great. So just touching on your time in the military. So if I remember correctly, you were a Green Beret. Is that that correct? And can you explain kind of what that means? What is a Green Beret?
Sure. So the media always gets this wrong. They'll always talk about special forces, and special forces is actually just Green Berets. And then you have this broader category of special operations, and that is, your CAG or Delta Force, that's your Navy SEALs, Rangers, and then special forces are a part of special operations. But what Green Berets specifically do, what kind of makes us unique, is the unconventional warfare, counterinsurgency, and what we refer to as foreign internal defense. And so whereas SEALs, Rangers, Delta guys, Green Berets, whereas we all do counterterrorism. All of us do close quarters battle. All of us know how to do like patrolling and things like that. Green Berets operate by, through, and with the local population. So we operate in 12-man teams. If anybody has seen like 12 Strong, that was the movie of Green Berets that linked up with the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan, and we're on horseback and doing all that stuff. That's what we do. We work through. So if we're doing unconventional warfare, then we have linked up with usually an insurgent group, and we are helping that insurgent group overthrow the government. And if we are conducting counterinsurgency, we're usually working with the government in order to defeat an insurgent element within. So we kind of joke that it's both sides of the same coin, which is COIN is the acronym for counterinsurgency. But that's the work that we do, and it's interesting because what's different from purely operating with Americans is we have to dive a lot deeper sometimes into kind of an understanding of the operational environment, not just with things like key terrain or your primary targets or things like that, but we have to delve a lot into cultural understanding, historical understanding, because we have to convince. A lot of times we're kind of in the middle of tribal disputes, and we're trying to get people to work together. And I was the senior advisor on operations, where half of my unit was Shia and the other half of my indigenous unit was Sunni.
Mm.
And there's always dynamics that you got to kind of work through, but that's what makes SF a little bit different. We're sometimes referred to as the warrior diplomats because we have that additional function. But it provides for a unique perspective, and I think a very interesting one. If I had to sum it up, I always tell people that Green Berets are not John Rambo. We're Lawrence of Arabia. That's the Green Beret idea.
Okay. All right. I think that I can roll with that. Help me
Yeah.
understand a little bit more. So did that time that you served as a Green Beret, if I remember correctly, you said in Iraq and Afghanistan. Is that where you served?
I only did 2 tours in Iraq.
Two tours in Iraq. Okay. And did that almost kind of shape you and form you? Like, how did that inform your politics?
Oh
From
gosh.
the time when you served, and then you obviously didn't continue with the military. You decided to get into politics. So what was the reasoning for that?
Well, I got done with our second tour in 2008 in Iraq was actually really successful. We rolled up a number of really bad guys, but I started to become really frustrated with the way I started to become very frustrated with U.S. foreign policy. It didn't strike me as being very coherent. A lot of the things that we were doing on a tactical level didn't make any sense to me, and that started to cause me to look more into the strategic level, and that stopped making sense to me. And so it wasn't that I doubted the quality of the service that my team was providing. I always tell people, as much as I'm frustrated with the reasoning that we went into Iraq or the way we withdrew from Afghanistan, I don't think that takes anything away from the individual service members that were conducting combat operations. But it did cause me to wonder a whole lot more about why are we doing what we are doing, and why hasn't Congress voted on any of it? I mean, other than spending bills in order to cover the expense of it, but they haven't actually displayed the moral courage in either declaring war, or kind of playing their constitutional role with respect to U.S. foreign policy, which is somewhat limited but still important, especially when it comes to combat operations. And that kind of caused me to question, like when I was growing up, my mom was the head of a Republican women's organization, and so I was kind of associated myself with um, the Republican Party, and I am an elected Republican, but I started to really question some of what we might call the neocon version or the neocon wing of the Republican Party. And I started becoming what I refer to as a lot more liberty oriented. And that was rooted in, studying people like Milton Friedman, Thomas Sowell, Ludwig von Mises, Frederick Bastiat, and really the founders, right? Jefferson, Madison. I actually represent Madison's district in the Virginia General Assembly. And it was about going back to this idea that, there's a lot of things that the government is doing that I don't think is its proper role or its proper place. And a lot of that was also informed by my Christian faith. It's the idea that just because something is maybe good or necessary doesn't mean it falls into the proper role of government. That I believe as you kind of study scripture, you look at the created order. There's the province of the individual, the province of the family, the province of the church, and the province of the state. And when we respect the individual duties and responsibilities within those places, we get a lot more harmony within society. We get a society which is much better at self-regulation of one's actions as opposed to requiring state intervention. And this goes back to the John Adams quote, right? That our Constitution was written for a moral and religious people and is totally unsuited to any other. And so a lot of that ended up informed that my experience in Iraq, and it kind of informed that through the defense policy standpoint and the foreign policy standpoint. The other thing that my service in Iraq and my service in special forces taught me is it is foolish to assume that we're all that we're all after the same thing, and that sometimes interests can align without values aligning, and sometimes values can align while processes differ. And that a lot of, if you want to actually get to a similar point, the first thing that you have to establish is, do we actually want the same thing? And then how do we view the proper way to get there? Not to mention, do we both have the same values or the same foundation that we believe in things like objective truth, objective morality? And if you believe in objective truth, if you believe in objective morality, if you believe in logic, then we can disagree on certain ways to get to the ultimate end state, right? Are people happy, healthy, prosperous, and free? But if you don't agree on those fundamentals, I've increasingly become convinced that, well, no, it's this isn't something where these ideas can peacefully coexist. One side's going to win and one side's going to lose. And so all of that has kind of formulated my overall, not just political philosophy, but my worldview and kind of how I process problems or issues into, is this something that we can solve, or is this something that is not even a legitimate function of government? And then what do we do from there?
Yeah, that's it's really interesting that you talk about I would say that there's been a break, if we're looking at left and right in our current cultural and political climate, like you would just mention, from objective truth. I think you see a current leftist, secular, atheistic philosophy that has really invaded the culture and has left a lot of people, I mean, all stranded, lost, miserable. And I think you see on the conservative side kind of a call back to traditional values, but I would say a call back to, I mean, everything that you just mentioned, a more almost like libertarian Christian founding view that America ultimately was founded and built upon.
No, I,
What?
I think it's I think that's accurate. Now, I will say this. So I have people, I have Democrats that I'm able to work with in the General Assembly, not because we agree on everything. In fact, we disagree on the majority of things, but they still have a commitment to objective truth and a logical thought process. So we can we can agree to disagree, and then we can work together on the things that we do agree on because we both commit to keep our word. But increasingly, the left has become defined not by what we would call liberalism in the classical sense, but by leftism. And what I mean by that is a combination of a, a, a Marxist explanation of the world. I'm not claiming that everybody on the left is a Marxist. I'm saying a Marxist explanation of the world combined with things like critical theory. So Marxism is the whole idea that you know people are exploited, that the private property contributes to the sort of disparities that we see, the unequal distribution of goods and services and wealth that leads to poverty and greed and everything else. And so it's that kind of Marxist explanation of what the problem is. Critical theory then breaks things down into this combination of, okay, now that we've identified the problem, now we got to separate people and who are the victims and who are the perpetrators, or the way that they usually say is, who are the oppressors and who are the oppressed. And then you have postmodernism, which is rooted in this, and deconstructionism, which is rooted in this idea of um, there is no objective truth. There's just perspective. So if you combine all those things, what you get is a left-wing ideology that is rooted in this idea that obviously there are bad things happening in the world. Um, there is no objective truth. There's just perspective. So whose perspective should we listen to? Well, obviously, we should listen to the perspective of the oppressed, right? We shouldn't listen to the perspective of the oppressor. They're the bad guy. And so how do we how do we achieve greater social justice? How do we create greater equity? Well, we concentrate power in the hands of the people that have been marginalized and their representatives. And then we use government power to more fairly distribute, or more equitably distribute, resources. That's become the left-wing narrative. And in some ways, you can market that in a way that sounds kind of like just a quest for fairness. Because obviously we can look at disparity within society and say, yes, some people have a whole lot and some people have next to nothing. And, what do we do about that, right? These are fair questions. But when you come to the conclusion, when leftism becomes this idea of we can look at a disparity and automatically associate the disparity with some sort of injustice that has taken place, and then assume for ourselves the authority to use violence or coercion in order to take from somebody in order to give to somebody else. Well, how do you distinguish that? Oppressor versus oppressed. Okay, well, how do you distinguish oppressor versus oppressed? Well, anybody that fits within our ideological category or our political affiliation, they're the oppressed because we're the representative for the downtrodden. And if you don't agree with us, well, then you're an oppressor. Well, gosh, that's a mighty convenient political philosophy, which gives you complete and total moral justification to use force and coercion against people you don't agree with in order to take their stuff and give it to your side. And that's a lot less flattering way to put it, but I think that's the logical outworking of that worldview. And increasingly, that's what we see the left defined by in the United States and largely the West, is it's no longer defined by kind of what we would have called maybe Democrat philosophy 30 or 40 years ago, which was rooted in this idea that, well, of course, we're committed to private property rights. And of course, we're committed to, objective truth and objective morality. But we think the government has a little bit more active role to play in leveling the playing field, right? That might have been considered the Democrat position. What I would argue is that the logical outworking of that theory is modern leftism. And so that's where we're at right now. And that's why I believe we've entered into a very, very different time period in American political and cultural history where these two things cannot peacefully coexist. These two theories cannot peacefully coexist. One will win and one will lose. And the question that we're going to have to ask ourselves as Americans is what sort of country that we want to live in? Because the modern leftist version of America bears zero resemblance to not only what we've had, but what we currently have. It would have to be fundamentally altered to make them happy.
Right. Well, wouldn't you say? I mean, I would say that from what I've seen, use people like the examples are people like Joe Rogan or even like an Elon Musk, people who you would call like your classical liberals, right? Or at least your liberals from maybe, I don't know, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
those individuals have ended up more on the right. And they use that graphic all the time where it's like I stayed right here, but the left went
Yeah.
so far left that, now I've ended up here on the right. But I mean, you said that, America is at a critical point right now, but I think that, and with what we saw in the last election, for example, that a lot of Americans, I think, are waking up to this idea that, the left, you can say, has gone too far, and that, the statement that was just made in this last election was that, no, we don't want to go that far. We want to kind of remain over here and stay true to these values.
Um, I don't I don't necessarily agree.
Okay.
I think that a lot more people, well, let me put it this way. I agree that a lot more people have woken up to the idea that the left has gone too far. I don't agree that most people have woken up to the reasons why that happened. And if you don't properly diagnose how you got here, then you're going to prescribe either wrong or insufficient solutions. And so I think people like Joe Rogan or Elon Musk, as much as I like them, right? Like I'm very appreciative because I do believe that they're people that still have a basic commitment to objective truth and objective morality, right? So they think logic works. They don't think logic is a tool of the patriarchy in order to, oppress people. They think it has incredibly valid use cases, which are not just useful, but binding. This is really important. It's not that the left has abandoned logic. They will utilize logic to the extent that it helps them with their overall objectives. But the moment it doesn't, they're fully fine with throwing it out and saying, well, you're just using it as a tool of the patriarchy. Joe Rogan doesn't believe that. Joe Rogan believes that if you can make a good logical argument with proper empirical evidence, you can change his mind. Right? Now, if it's a core belief of his, it might take more logic and more empirical evidence and more convincing, but he can have his mind changed. That's not the position of the modern left. The problem is that I think Joe Rogan and Elon Musk and others think that, well, if we could just go back 20 years, I'd be fine. Okay, then you fundamentally misunderstand what has been taking place. You fundamentally misunderstand what people like Antonio Gramsci were writing about in the 30s. You fundamentally misunderstand what Herbert Marcuse was writing about and teaching in the 60s and 70s. You fundamentally misunderstand what Saul Alinsky was about. Um, this has been a concerted effort for over a century to get us where we're at within the United States right now. Some people call it the long march through the institutions. That's based off of some of Gramsci's writings. He didn't coin that term, but he did coin the term cultural Marxism. And it was the idea that the reason why Marxism had not been successful in the past was not because Marx was fundamentally wrong with his diagnosis of the problem and his offering of a potential solution. It was mainly because the capitalist West had essentially set up all of these cultural institutions, whether it be education, whether it be the family, um, whatever else it might be, that protected and insulated that culture from Marxist ideas. And so if we ever wanted to get to the sort of place where we lived in a society where it was based on, from each according to their ability and to each according to their need, well, then they were going to have to either infiltrate and take over cultural institutions or set up competing cultural institutions in order to achieve that. And that has effectively been accomplished in most of the culturally shaping institutions within the United States. If you look at the now, I would say there's some significant pushback in ways that are new and exciting to me. But if we were to look at the state of affairs in America 5 years ago, we would have said media probably 70 to 80% dominated by the left. We would have said education probably 80 to 90% dominated by the left. Hollywood, arts, and entertainment 90% dominated by the left. The church maybe about 30% dominated by the left, but that was a huge incursion, huge. Now it might be higher to 40%. We would have said the bureaucracy, like state bureaucracies, federal bureaucracy, probably about 70 to 80% dominated by the left. Okay, well, what are the culturally shaping institutions within our life? Well, it's the family, it's your education system, it's arts and entertainment, it's bureaucratic institutions that we rely upon for either like our courts of justice or our lawmaking capabilities, things of that nature, law enforcement, higher ed. So if all those things have been taken over essentially by a left-wing ideology, a predominantly left-wing ideology, I don't think we should be surprised when now all of a sudden that becomes the dominant cultural ideology. And since politics is downstream from culture, we shouldn't be surprised when it becomes the dominant political culture or ideology. And so what I want people like Joe Rogan and Elon Musk and others to understand is that this is a much bigger problem than just, well, can we just turn back the clock, 20 years? The answer is no, because the things that were going on 20 years, even if you were somewhat more comfortable with them, were never the end state. Right. We have a saying on our podcast at Making the Argument, and my buddy, my co-host Christian says this a lot. He goes, the issue is never the issue. The issue is the revolution. um, and when you study kind of Marxist ideology and Marxist kind of plans for implementation, that's what you find. The revolution is always ongoing because they're attempting to perfect humanity. And when you attempt to perfect something which cannot be perfected, the revolution never ends. And when your plans don't work the way you wanted them to, you always have to find justification outside of your ideology to explain why they didn't work, which means you have to consistently find new enemies. You have to consistently find, if grievance is going to be the rallying cry for your political ideology, then you constantly have to find new victims. And if you can't find them, you have to create them. And who's going to tell me we're not living in a society where we are obsessed with grievance and we keep creating brand new categories of grievance so that we can sustain new enemies or create new enemies and have new victims that we have to advocate on behalf of. And all of it always leads toward the same direction, the concentration of political power into the hands of the people that are purveying that particular ideology. And so that's why I say, like, this is an all-encompassing theory here. It doesn't It doesn't end anywhere else but kind of totalitarianism because it has to. And so it's not good enough to say, well, I think they've gone too far in this category. You have to understand what led us up to that point in the first place and really ask yourself the question, what sort of society do you actually want to live in?
So what you're saying is that this has been something that's been festering for much longer than over the last 20 years. Like Joe Rogan saying, "Oh, if we could just go back to being, on the left 20 years ago, it looks different." This has been something that's been kind of festering. I mean, well, I would argue in the United States, maybe for the last, 100 years. I mean, this is something that always festers in society. I mean, and I think that's where I want to kind of turn this conversation spiritual. I mean, would you say it's a diabolical spirit? Would you say that this is, I mean, looking at things from zooming out, looking at things from a higher level? Like, are we talking about, I mean, I believe that we're talking about spiritual warfare. I think that's kind of what we're always talking about here.
Oh,
But
this is original sin.
mhm, mhm,
This is original sin. I mean, here's what I find fascinating, and it's another one of the reasons why I think Christianity does such a good job of explaining reality. I don't just believe it because I find it convenient or I appreciate the morals or some of the cultural connotations of it. I believe it because I think it's true, and
mhm.
it's interesting because you'll even look at parts of Scripture that maybe some people debate whether or not it's poetry or allegory or poetry or actual history. But let's take the Garden of Eden, for instance. All right. So what does God say? God creates everything, sees that it's good, creates man. He creates something in his own image that he wants to have a relationship with. Um, so God is loving, God is just. He wants to create something he can have a relationship with. In order to be able to have genuine relationship, in order to be able to genuinely love, you have to be able to have the option to not engage in relationship and to not love. Okay, so sets up a perfect environment, right? Which even I think on some level, even the communists would agree. Perfect environment. You're in the garden. It's you have community. You have everything that you want. You have noble work and purpose. You have all of it, right? And God gives one rule. One rule: don't eat from that tree. That's it. That's the one rule. So he's made everything perfect. He's created ideal conditions. But in order to have relationship, we still have to have the ability, genuine relationship, we still have to have the ability to rebel. Okay. So how do they get us to rebel? How do they get Adam and Eve to rebel? Well, the first thing is the questioning of what God has said. Right. That's one of the first questions the serpent asks Eve, right? Is like, did God really say? So now he's getting her to question the fundamental truth, the objective truth of that environment, and that is God said, "Don't do this." Well, did he really say that? And so now it's causing her to question. And then she says, "Well, if well, yeah, he did say that." So she's confirmed that this is the truth. He did say that because we'll die. Well, okay, now the question shifts. It's no longer did God say that, is what's God's motivation? Oh, well, God's lying to you. You're not going to die. You'll become like God. Ooh, well, that's tempting, right? That's tempting to people. Well, I want to be, because that's been kind of the biggest fight of all of humanity is this idea of wanting to be our own God, wanting to be in control of our own future. And there's an aspect of that which I think is completely understandable. There's a motivation there's also a very, very dark side to that impulse. And so, um, and so Eve takes the bait, right? Eve takes the bait, and then we end up in a fallen world. But I always say that the fundamental question that we've been answering ever since that first question was posed to us as humanity um, is did God really say, and what were God's motivations? And what we're being offered, what we're continually being offered in exchange for rejecting what God has told us is true, is the ability to be our own God. And and obviously I don't mean in the macro sense that you're going to be able to create your own universe, you're going to be, but I'm going to have complete autonomy over my own decisions. Now, let's look at that from a positive manifestation versus a negative manifestation. The positive manifestation of recognizing that people are created in the image of God, right? The proper way to look at this is, yes, you do have value, you have inherent value and worth because you're created in the image of God, and God has created you to be able to have a certain degree of autonomy. You're not free from God's truth, but you are free to interact with God's created order, and you can choose to rebel. You can choose to rebel, or you can choose to do the right thing. The negative manifestation of that is I'm going to choose to rebel because I don't think the creator of the universe should have any say over what I do or how I behave or how I react. Well, the implication of that is not just to, quote, reject God or reject Christianity. It's then, as even Nietzsche acknowledged, it's the, okay, well, what do we do now? What happens to all of our categories of right and wrong? What happens to all of our categories of truth? What happens to all of our categories of understanding human interaction and motivation and reality? Well, it all gets reduced to either the quest for power or the quest for pleasure, or maybe the quest for both. And what is right and wrong anymore? That's subjective. Okay, so okay, well then how do we impose things? What's the moral order that we utilize to do that? Well, we can come up with all sorts of utilitarian explanations, but ultimately, if you're willing to reject the notion of God, then you are fundamentally willing to reject the notion of objective truth and objective morality. And now everything is subject to essentially either consensus or really power, your ability to impose your will on other people. And it's funny that Nietzsche, the same guy who wrote and so says Zarathustra, God is dead, predicted that the following century, as that idea would gain prominence, would become the most bloodiest in world history. And lo and behold, he was correct. Now, where do I go with all of this? And how do I plug this into what we're going on right now? Because it's a very logical outworking once you reject objective truth and objective morality, then to say, okay, we still have to live, we still have to interact, we still have ideas of what we think should happen versus shouldn't happen. How do we properly organize and adjudicate that? Well, the left has a solution, and that leftist solution is inherently rooted in political power. The Marxists, the true Marxists would say, well, ultimately it's anarcho-communism, right? It's like, oh no, we don't need a government at the final stage of communism. We don't need a government because, everything is owned in kind and it's a perfect utopia. Okay, well, there's an increasing stack of bodies that have been made in search of that utopia. And so, to your point, I do think it's spiritual. It has to be fundamentally at a fundamental level. It has to be spiritual because the great debate has been going on since the beginning of humankind, and that is the question over who's in charge. um, is there objective morality? Is there objective truth? And if these things exist, who says so?
Hmm.
And what is our obligation to
Hmm.
that? And so, yeah, ultimately it is. Ultimately, there it is spiritual. It has to be.
Yeah, I agree. And I think what's interesting to think about, and I want you to answer this question, and then we'll see where it goes from there. But if you were in the business of destroying humanity, of destroying societies, etc., where would you attack first? Who would you go after?
The youth. You always go after the youth. Um, it was interesting. I was on the Sean Ryan show, and he asked me, he goes, Nick, you're a counterinsurgency. He goes, you're a Green Beret. This is kind of your realm. Like, how do you destabilize a country? And what I told him was, is we have to destabilize the culture. You have to fundamentally alter the way that a group of people think about themselves, and you have to reshape what they want their future to be. And a lot of that ends up controlling how they understand their past. So how do you do that? Well, it's a multi-generational process, and it has to be, you have to control education. I think it's one of the reasons why some of the first institutions that the left really became dominant in were academia and Hollywood. So it's the if you think about those two things, what is it? Well, it's shaping young minds on how to think about their past, how to think about their present, and how to think about their future. It's not just about interacting with it. It's become largely prescriptive in nature. So we're not just teaching you how to think critically. We're teaching you what we think you should think about these things. And then Hollywood has a huge say in the way that we understand ourselves, our culture, and our past. Because a lot of people's understanding of our past is not rooted in some sort of rigorous academic research of original source documents. It's in a movie they see about a particular thing or a song they listen to about a particular event, and that ends up inevitably, whether they are fully conscious of it or not, shaping their worldview. And so I think that's where you have to, if you're serious about it, it all has to do with education and who is responsible for raising children and educating children. It's another reason why Karl Marx and Frederick Engels despised the traditional family and believed that children should be educated collectively and raised collectively. That's why when I see things like, well, it takes a village, I understand that a strong knit community can be very, very important and informative for raising a child. But when they say it takes a village, I do not believe that they mean the same thing that we would maybe in Christian circles if it takes an extended family or it takes a husband and a wife, a mother and a father. It takes a
A
strong knit
group of
church family.
like-minded nuclear families around
Yes.
that support each other. Yeah, that have
Yeah,
similar
that's
values. Yep. Yep.
exactly. That's not what they mean. So that's how you do it. And they've been very, very successful at it.
Yeah, so I agree with you. I think and your answer to the question on the Sean Ryan show, how do you destabilize a society? You go after the youth, you destabilize the youth. I agree. Here's where I would disagree that the Hollywood and the education system, absolutely they've been compromised, and absolutely that's a way to do it. But I think where the spiritual battle exists, and I think where, if we want to call it the enemy, has attacked or is attacking or really going after, it's the family unit. And
Oh yeah.
it's men and it's fathers specifically. Because if you want to destabilize children, and all the stats support this, you destabilize, you take out the father, right? You take out
Yeah.
their father. This is why I believe, I mean, this is one of the main reasons I want to talk to you. This is one of the reasons I think your timing and your influence is so incredibly important in our culture, is because we need good, strong, virtuous, I mean, I would argue Christian men who can take on this fight and who recognize that it is a spiritual battle.
Mhm.
Um, but that's where, I mean, again, if you're looking to destabilize, if you're looking to ruin a society, you're looking to ruin humanity, ruin human beings, you have to go after the youth, you go after fathers. But this is where I would say your work is so instrumental. Here's what I want to ask you though, because I was talking with my friends about this the other day, and we came up with a statistic because it's not easy to find. If you look at societal number statistics, it's not easy to find good, high character, virtuous men who are striving along the path toward sainthood, who God made them to be. We came up with a number, and I don't know if this is accurate. I have no stats to back this up, but I asked how many men, from a percentage standpoint, would you say in this world are not captured by some sin, whether it be pornography, gambling, drugs, alcohol, whatever you want to
Yeah.
call it? How many men, I want to ask you that question. How many men would you say in this world are not captured by one of those things?
So let me see if I properly understand. When you say capture, do you mean struggling against, or do you mean to have just completely given into it?
Given into it. So
Oh,
I understand we all
yeah,
struggle against these things, absolutely.
yeah,
But I mean, you have to acknowledge that there are men who are actively fighting against it to remain on the path, and and
yeah,
to avoid sin, right? There are men who are striving to avoid sin, And then there
Yeah,
are men,
yeah.
when I say captured by it, are actively participating in it on a daily basis. So
Yeah,
I'm talking
actively
about,
participate. Yeah, I would say so. Let me just break it down into one other subcategory. Um, I think when we're talking about people that are so captured by it that that they're not only struggling but losing,
mhm.
right? That's probably, if I had to guess, I would say that's 30 to 45%. I no, let me take that back. Let's take 100%. I think over 50% of men don't even realize it's a fight. They think it's perfectly morally justifiable. Who cares what they do, with their own time, whether they're not hurting anybody else, blah, blah, blah. So that's over 50% that don't even necessarily ascribe to it a significant moral question.
I'd agree that the majority of men
Yeah,
are have usurped their conscience and are just participating in a life of sin.
yeah, yeah. I think the one that's probably the most pervasive is on that one for men is probably porn.
Yeah.
It's probably the idea that, hey, I'm not hurting anybody, and this is just something. Now, that's over 50% that don't see or don't really struggle with the idea that they're doing anything wrong. Out of the remaining, we'll say 50%, just to make this easy. I think there's probably another 40% that are, well, let's say, actually, we'll say 30%. There's another 30% that recognize that there's something wrong, but feel like it's completely insurmountable or don't really see light at the end of the tunnel for overcoming it. And that would leave 20% of men that I think, we'll say 15% of men that struggle, that are still fighting, but are, are, are through the grace of God and through the moving of the Holy Spirit overcoming. That leaves 5% that I think are probably in a place where um, they have really kind of been able, and not, and again, not that they don't, we'll say kind of like the St. Paul version, right? There's still that thorn in their side, but they understand their mission. They put the proper boundaries in place. They have the proper friend group. They're walking strong within their relationship with God. Um, it's probably 5%. And again, this is this is totally off the top of my head. I'm not basing this off of anything other than kind of what I read and what I observe. Um, and it's tough. But yeah, I think that's probably where we are at. And to your point earlier too about, when I say going after the youth and I look at education and Hollywood and how that influences it, I mean, you're absolutely right that the family is a core component of that. And that's why I brought up Marx saying that, they despise the family and they believe that children should be raised collectively. And to your point, how do you dismantle that? Well, you have to take out man's role within society. And that has been it's interesting when we talk about certain elements of feminism early on that had fairly limited goals of we would like to vote, we would like to be able to own property, right? Like that all seems pretty reasonable to us now, right? Not a question there. But there's no doubt that modern feminism has been captured by an ideology that has sought to significantly undermine. I think to your point, communism didn't always try to emasculate men, right? Far from it. Other what you would call atheistic political ideologies or cultural ideologies, which were rooted on government power, didn't try to emasculate men, right? The fascists didn't try to emasculate men. Um, this has been the first time that I've seen a concerted movement to legitimately emasculate men and diminish their role in society and treat them as if they are the source of what's wrong with everything. And you're right. Whenever we're looking for commonalities within statistics having to do with things like crime, abuse, drug use, suicide, one of the most common trends that we see among all of that is a lack of positive male role models within someone's life. And what's interesting is that even when the left acknowledges that, their view of what a positive male role model is bears very little resemblance to what our view of a positive male role model is. And I was recently on a podcast with Francis and Constantine on trigonometry, And they asked me, what is what is the thing that nobody's talking about that we should be? And I said, well, I don't want to claim nobody's talking about it, but it's the fact that young men are going to revolt. Young men are going to, and when they do, they're going to win. This idea that wokeism ever had a shot at winning is absurd. There has never been a period in human history where an ideology which systematically attempted to emasculate men was successful in becoming the dominant culture. You can't, why? Well, I don't know. Go take a look at the military, go take a look at law enforcement, go take a look at all the people that we utilize to fight and impose policy. You're going to notice a really common trend. They're men,
Hmm.
and they tend to be younger men. And you've now alienated them from your ideology. They're going to revolt and they will win. The question is who are they going to follow in that process? Are they going to follow someone that tells them correctly that they were lied to about these absurd categories of toxic masculinity, that they were lied to about they're the source of all the evil and problems in the world? And so now what you should do is develop your capabilities, enhance your strength, and then go punish everybody that did this to you. And oh, by the way, you should be dominating society now, right? Like, do we want to turn young men into barbarians, right? Hedonistic, power hungry barbarians? Because that is an option. That is an option. Or do we want to turn them into what we would refer to as the biblical model for masculinity, which is strong, capable, powerful, but also intellectual, compassionate, noble? And that's the big fight that's going on right now. And I honestly, I don't know which side's going to win in the immediate future because there's so much frustration and animosity that has been built up, combined with combined with various vices, combined with and a growing animosity toward women. And I sometimes I want to look at the feminist movement. I want to say, I realize you hate me, right? I realize you think everything I stand for is horrible and miserable and wrong. But do you realize I'm one of the guys trying to stay, even though you hate me, even though you are shooting me in the back as I do it, I am trying to stand in between, not your ideology, but I'm trying to stand in between your physical person and a generation of young men who are justifiably furious with you and trying to get them to understand that, look, guys, the ideology is the enemy, right? The spiritual battle, the unseen battle, that's the one that's the enemy, right? Don't take it out on the flesh and blood. We want to convince people of a right way of thinking, not just punish our enemies. And that becomes a really, really hard argument to make to a group of young men who increasingly feel alienated, emasculated, and quite frankly, are increasingly looking for revenge. But you're absolutely right. If you want to stop that trend in its tracks, the most effective way to do it is with strong fathers who also need to be strong husbands. Um, Strong husbands, strong fathers who recognize not only their authority, but also the duties and responsibilities associated with that authority,
Yeah.
and who execute it to the love, provision, and protection of their families, which ultimately means the love, protection, and provision of the society.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting that you touched on kind of I think the revolt is happening. Um Said men are going to revolt. I believe that we're seeing the revolt
Yeah,
playing out. It's interesting you talked about the two ways that men have to go, and I think that it's interesting to think about. So you have a guy, I'm just going to use a name here, like an Andrew Tate. Um, he is almost the model of that kind of man that you described, right? Where they're pissed at women, and that's certainly justified. But there's almost like this men go your own way.
yeah,
Well, there is that movement online for
yeah.
sure.
It's got its own acronym.
It's got its own acronym. That's right. But the problem with the path that a guy like Andrew Tate leads men down and I've made this argument online many, many times, is that it doesn't produce good and strong, stable husbands and families.
Yeah. No, John Lovell, who is somebody that I really respect, and I think he's an incredibly important voice in this space. Another one is Chad Robichaud. Um, we've all kind of collectively had these discussions about, what about Andrew and Tristan Tate? What about Justin Waller? What about the guys on Fresh and Fit podcast? Because they're advocating for a kind of masculinity that we obviously disagree with on a fundamental level, even though we agree with certain aspects of it.
Yeah.
And we certainly agree that there's aspects of the problem that they have very properly diagnosed. And let's face it, they have the courage to get out there and start to call out that problem. Uh, they got out there and started to call out the problem when Christian men were still content to sit on their hands and be like, oh, well, like, no, I don't know. I don't know. You gave young men who were looking for some sort of model nothing to follow because you didn't want to stand up and challenge the culture. You wanted to be seeker friendly or whatever else we're calling it these days. Whereas guys like Tristan and Andrew and Justin, they got up and called it out. They spoke to what young men were dealing with. And instead of just telling young men to suck it up and do better, they actually said, no, you're justified in your frustration. And so one of the things I always I caution myself on, um, and I try to caution other people in this place too, is I kind of feel like it is easy for us to, and I'm not saying you are doing this, by the way, because I think you bring up a very valid point, and this illustration needs to be discussed, and those names need to be brought up as we discuss these options.
Yeah, no, and actually, and let me clarify something real quick. So there
Yeah,
was a lot of what Andrew and Tristan and Justin were saying that I agree with and that I honestly bought into. And there is an aspect of their message that for me as a Christian man woke me up to a lot of things that I was frankly unaware of. So I
yeah,
absolutely think that we should give credit where credit's due. And I agree with you with what they did to wake Christian men up. And we absolutely have a Christian male leadership problem. And none of us were willing
yeah,
to step up and do the things that they did. Now, now what we can look at is what I'm saying though now is that give them credit for doing those types of things, for doing those things, but their solution though is not here's what I'd say is not ideal for men
no.
because it leads men away from being the husbands and fathers that we need. So that's where I think now it's like, okay, that's where us Christian men and leaders need to step
Yeah.
up and show men that we have a better way and a better vision.
So I think that is perfectly articulated. And the reason why is this. Here's what I've noticed. Um, the we'll call it for lack of a better term, we'll call it like the woke movement. And when I say woke, what I mean are people that essentially assign um, people that essentially put people into oppressed and oppressed classes based off of disparities within society that they automatically chalk up to things like racism, sexism, bigotry, and then believe that they need more power in order to adjudicate that. That's what I mean by woke. They had no use for a guy like me. None, zero. Hated me. I was I still see it in my comments every once in a while when I'll talk about something with being a husband or being a father. We're like, that's toxically masculine, right? You're a toxic male, blah, blah, blah. No use for me, except when it comes to combating Andrew Tate.
Hmm.
Then they want me to stand up and do something. Hey, you're a Christian man, Nick. You say you got to do this. What do you think about when Tristan Tate or when Andrew Tate said this? Like, oh, you've caught on to something finally. And what you've caught on to is you can't beat Tristan. You can't beat Andrew. You can't beat Justin. You don't have the physical capability. Um, you can't do it. And so what are you looking for now? You're looking around, okay, who are other people that are also in this space, but that fundamentally disagree with certain moral elements of what Andrew Tate is saying? Okay, I want you two to fight it out. Oh, you want me to fight? You want us to fight and kill off each other because you can't do it,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's exactly what's going on. And the thing that I will say is Yeah, I fundamentally disagree with a lot of the. I, I think I think in many cases they've accurately diagnosed aspects of the problem, but they've offered cures that I think are also bad. I don't believe men are supposed to. I believe men are just supposed to be just as faithful to their wives physically as wives are supposed to be faithful to their husbands. I think this idea, one of the things that Andrew says that I just don't think makes a lot of sense when you actually study it from a historical standpoint is they'll say, well, the top G's always had harems. Okay. And go take a look at was one of the most destabilizing features of the sort of countries where the leaders had harems. It
Hmm.
was the harem, right?
Hmm.
That ended up being the destabilizing factor within their immediate family, where now all of a sudden you have half brothers killing each other in order to determine who has the throne, where you have court intrigue taking place, which ends up diminishing the society. So it diminished the family at the top of the power structure, and then it diminished the rest of the society as a result. So no, it isn't pure hedonism, does not, and I'm not saying that Andrew argues for pure hedonism, but what color is my Bugatti does not actually provide me meaning and purpose in this world. Nothing wrong with owning a cool Bugatti, but it doesn't offer ultimate meaning and purpose. And understanding what is not just what sounds good, but what is true is fundamental to getting this right. But my hope and my prayer for Andrew or for Justin is not that they be crushed. Um, I think I think they were offered, I think they saw themselves as being offered one of two directions. They could be sheep or they could be wolves. And they were not going to be sheep.
Hmm.
And I respect that. Um, there is another option, though. And I think on some level they understand that because they talk about the importance of friendship. They talk about the importance of family. They're not just out there saying, live it up, do whatever you want. No, they want you to find purpose and meaning in relationships, but I think it's off. It's askew. And because of that, it will never provide them the ultimate purpose or meaning that they're looking for because it's not rooted in what I would say is biblical truth and honor, ultimately honor. Um, but yeah, I want to be careful that we don't buy into this trap that I think that the left or modern feminism or the woke have set for us, which is, well, we can't defeat these guys because we don't ultimately possess the strength necessary to do it. So let's get them to beat up each other, and then we can rule by proxy.
Hmm.
And I don't want that either.
Yeah, the main issue that I would say that they are leading men down a path that, I would say leads to destruction, but it leads to the destabilization of a family and a society is simply, I mean, it's simply the issue of polygamy or polygyny that they model by example. I mean, that's just what it comes down to. That's what it comes down to right there. That's the issue. And if they, again, build yourself up into a strong man, become competent, become someone who is capable of providing and leading a family, a wife, and children. But
Yeah,
you gotta fight for that nuclear family. That is how, I mean, I argue that's how we were made to live.
yeah.
That is what is aligned with reality, and that is what's going to give men the most meaning and fulfillment in their life.
Well, and it's interesting because they will point to categories within masculinity and femininity. So, for instance, when it comes to them saying that, well, yeah, a woman should be faithful to her husband, but a husband's version of being faithful to a woman in their mind is not necessarily physical. It's the protection and provision. So if I protect for you and I provide for you as the my wife and as the mother of my children, I am fulfilling my obligations to you as your husband, and then I can go seek the desires that I have from a physical nature from other women, and I'm not being unfaithful in their mind because you're the one I'm providing the protection and provision to. And again, they look to history for that, and they say, well, yeah, even in the Bible, right? David, Solomon. I mean, it's important to
Right.
understand though that when we see even those contexts within Scripture, those are violations of God's law. It's actually one of the things I really admire about the Bible is people will say, "Oh, well, but David did this, yeah, and he was punished for it,
Hmm.
yeah, and he was condemned for it," because our Scripture for us is not simply We didn't erase the embarrassing parts. We documented them to demonstrate that even the strong, even the people that are seeking God can fall in to these traps. And it's incredibly harmful for them, for the people they love, for their country, for their relationship with God, all of it. So don't fall into that trap. But what they'll look at is that the way that men and women view sex differently, and they'll come to the conclusion that therefore we should engage in sexual activity differently. And, I was having a conversation with Lila Rose about this, and I said, look, I can acknowledge that infidelity, or let's say multiple sexual partners, impacts men differently than it impacts women. That doesn't mean it's morally justifiable. Um, I can look at other aspects that impact men differently than impact women, how men process things different than women process them. Now, you can come to the conclusion that what that means is that we have very different moral codes along those categories, or you can come to the conclusion that in each one of those attributes, in each one of those areas where masculinity has a particular inclination and femininity has a different inclination, that there is a positive manifestation and a negative one. There's what God is calling us to do with that attribute, and there's what Satan is calling us to do with that attribute. And our job is to renew our minds and renew our thinking in accordance with what God would want. God is not silent on whether or not men should be sexually faithful to their wives. It's absolute. Thou shalt not commit adultery. It made one of the big 10, people. It made one of the big 10. And every single time that we see a man violating that within biblical history, we see problems. The thing that I would say is I think what is empowering about this is that rather than look at it as well, this is just a weakness, that this is a thorn in our side that we constantly have to fight against. It's like, okay, but why did God set it up this way? And I want to talk here for a second, not to get too descriptive, but let's just say informative, because this is something that I don't think Christians talk about enough, and that is what is God's proper view for sex? Because somewhere within Christianity, we almost maybe took an idea where we don't talk about it within its proper terms, and that is it's the idea that no, this is supposed to be a beautiful thing between a husband and a wife. And if you want to actually maximize it, right? If you want to make it as beautiful and as fun and as productive as it can possibly be, then you have to actually think about what do both people need? What is the feminine need and what is the masculine need with respect to this godly ordained thing? And for a woman to be, for your wife to be fully, engaged, she needs to feel security. She needs to feel loved. She needs to feel connection. How is she supposed to feel that with you if she constantly feels that she's being compared to a number of other faceless women? How is she supposed to feel that? You are by definition diminishing what that part of your marriage and life could be by stepping out. You're diminishing it. You're making it worse. Okay, what are you making it worse for? Well, for like a random experience with somebody else. Okay, so somebody that you might be attracted to, but that you don't love, that you don't have any deep emotional connection to, that doesn't understand your kind of likes, wants, needs, and preferences. You don't understand hers. So you are diminishing the thing which has the capability of reaching the very height of, sexual enjoyment within its proper boundaries. You are diminishing that in order to have some sort of like fast food version of it. So that's the other thing that I would ask people to understand is that you are not missing out by being faithful to your wife. The way I put it to my buddies in the Army, because look, I was in the special operations community is generally made up of fairly confident, in shape, capable guys, right? And we go to a lot of countries and we go to a lot of places, and there is no shortage of women that would throw themselves at that sort of guy for any variety of reasons. And that was obviously not something that I partook in. And every once in a while I'd get teased a little bit, not because they wanted me to be unfaithful with my wife, but it was this novel idea that um, here I was a special ops guy and I had only been with one woman. And so I get teased on that a little bit, like, do you guys take your socks off? Like, it was that sort of stuff. And I finally looked at somebody, one of my buddies one day, I said, you know what, bud, let me tell you something. You have a GED in like 30 women. I have a PhD in one. Who do you think is honestly having a better time? Right? Who do you honestly think knows what they're doing? Right? I am with a woman that I love, respect, admire, that I am passionate about. You're with some random woman that you thought was good enough looking for the night. And she thought the same thing about you, by the way. And by the way, if those were the conditions in which you met, you certainly were not the first dude there. Right? But I have someone that knows that I absolutely love and committed to her, which means she can be completely open and free with me. You want a good sex life? Okay, then demonstrate love, compassion, commitment, and passion with your wife, and she will be far more likely to do the same for you. You will be far more likely to communicate about things and develop good habits, wholesome habits that are also passionate and exciting habits. Why? Because there's nothing wrong with what you're doing. You're doing it within the proper boundaries that God provided. And so you have the capability to actually maximize that experience in a way that the dude that is going out there and just racking up a body count can't. And so, like anything else in life, sometimes foregoing the cheap, immediate pleasure in order to actually go for something so much more rich and enduring, and therefore ultimately far more passionate. I mean, that's a no-brainer to me. That's a no-brainer to me.
It's a no-brainer, and your experience is similar to mine. Now, I wasn't in the military, but I played Division I college baseball, and
Yeah.
you're on a team with a bunch of dudes that are
Yeah.
confident and,
Yeah.
they can pull girls. I played with a lot of guys that didn't have any problem, getting girls. And some of them, a lot of them got with a lot of them. And I met my wife in high school, and we got married right after college, and and we waited until we were married, right? So
Yeah.
and I got crap for that.
Yeah.
I got made fun of by guys on my team. Now,
Yeah.
it's not like, it was playful. It wasn't anything that
Yeah.
was, over the top or whatever, but I was that guy that wasn't going around sleeping with all of these other girls. And, and what I can tell you is this, like, and you can probably attest to this, but what we have now is something that is just significantly more meaningful, deep, rich, as you said, and something that I find is it's a treasure. Like it's something that we cherish now, and that we know that we know deeply and fully that we are each other's. And
Yeah.
in a world where marriage is being attacked and marriages are falling apart, it's almost, again, like, I believe God guided us the whole way, and he
Yeah.
obviously still is, but it's given us an armor in
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
world where a lot of people are defenseless. And it's
Well,
almost like go ahead.
people don't understand how that aspect of your relationship impacts everything else. This is another thing that allows for communication to be better because, a lot of times I don't think women sometimes understand how important that aspect of the relationship is to men. I mean, it is really important. And
Mhm.
that's not a bad thing. It's not because we're disgusting. It's not because but God made us a certain way. And now there's appropriate boundaries. We've just discussed some of those, right? And there's appropriate boundaries within marriage as well.
Mhm.
Um, but that part is important. And when you're in a loving relationship where there's trust, you can actually effectively communicate. And when there is security in that aspect of your marriage, it impacts every other aspect of your marriage. And that's really important to understand. That's why racking up the massive body counts makes things more difficult. I'm not to say, and look, I always want to make this clear for anybody, man or woman, that maybe lived a very different life when they were younger. One of the most redeeming, one of the things that I find the most reassuring about my Christian faith is the capacity for redemption uh, through repentance. So I don't mean to imply to anybody that, well, if you've already done X, Y, and Z, I guess there's no hope for it. That is not, no, that is unbiblical. You are going to have to overcome some things because there are consequences to actions. But the redemptive power of God is so incredible. In fact, a friend of mine, Josh Brome, former adult movie star, who left that life, was committing suicide or was contemplating suicide at one point, but he left that life, started to do something else, and found a girl that he really liked, who was a really strong Christian, and finally convinced her to go out with him. And on their first date, he said, "Look, I'm gonna tell you before you Google it."
Hmm.
And she looked at him and she goes, "You're not defined by the worst thing that you've ever done. It's, let me tell you about the goodness of Christ. Let me tell you about the goodness of God." And now they are, happily married, kids, and he ministers to young men about this, that there is hope, there is redemption, but part of that comes with acknowledging that this is such a sacred, and that's the thing. It's because it's so sacred and important to God that He puts the boundaries that He does on it, and that He rewards the following of those boundaries, right? He rewards the following of those boundaries.
Hmm.
Uh, but anyway, I guess I didn't mean to totally, you know, um, get off on that tangent, but I do think it's important to understand that what we are ultimately offering, as men, what we're ultimately offering on this category is so much more enriching, so much more fun, so much more passionate than what I think a lot of other people in this space are offering from a more secular viewpoint.
I agree, but I think it's important to talk about because I think that, especially young people, they needed inspiring vision for their life. And that's something that we've, from the Christian side of things, have ultimately failed to offer men. We haven't been able to articulate it. We haven't been able to, I don't know, publicly model it as well as we probably should. So certainly you see guys with the charisma and the physical stature and the competence and the money, that someone like Andrew Tate has, and there are going to be a lot of guys that are drawn to that
Yeah.
model. So
That's
it's
another
not
reason why I
surprising.
think,
I just think it's important that we articulate and that we sell a better vision. And I think
oh
that's
yeah,
something
no,
that you're doing, Nick. I really
well,
think that.
well, you as well, and I appreciate that because there's a reason why when people ask me like what other men in this space that you really admire, I always talk about John Lovell, Chad Robichaud, um, Victor Marx, and one of those things that those guys all have in common is they're not just they're and I hate to say it this way because they should be synonymous. They're not just Christian men, they're masculine men. Now, a Christian man should be a masculine man, right? That should be the case. But that's not the perception in much of society right now. The perception within society, the Christian man is a nice guy.
Yeah.
Um, I was speaking at events once. I said, "Do you know why nice guys finish last? Because they should." Jesus was not a nice guy. Jesus was an honorable man. He's God, right? But and he was honorable. He was strong. He was a truth speaker. He was intellectual. He was compassionate. He was empathetic. He had a capacity for violence, right? He was all of these things. And we've been taught this neo, I don't know, nice guy version that isn't accurate. And one of the things I love about, a guy like Chad Robichaud is, that guy was a Marine Force recon guy and a professional MMA fighter, right?
Hmm.
Like there's nobody who's going to tell Chad Robichaud, oh, he's just a low T male. Oh, really? Like, you will probably say that from a safe distance, right? You're never saying that. And the thing is that I want Christian men to once again embrace this idea and this is okay, I'm just going to say this. If you are if you are the fat, soft, weak Christian guy that thinks you should be listened to because you can quote scripture, I got news for you. Young men aren't listening to you. They're just not. I'm not saying you've got to be a barbarian. I'm not saying you've got to be a professional UFC fighter. Um, right? But you should be bold. You should be intelligent. You should be capable. You should be strong for the people around you. Like I look at Cliff, right, who always goes and teaches on college campuses. I don't think that guy's a professional UFC fighter, but I see a guy who's a real man. He's bold. He's not afraid to walk into the environment of ideas and talk about things. Um, I think all of that is just absolutely critical. Absolutely critical.
I totally agree, and I think the masculinity that's missing from the Christian male vision is something that I think it is being revived.
Yeah.
I think it's being, again, we have examples, the guys that you just talked about, you yourself, um, and I totally agree with you. I mean, the pudgy intellectual type that is steamrolled by his peers and steamrolled by women is not something that's attractive to men. So,
Mhm.
but it's also not virtuous, right? So virtue also includes building yourself up into a physical, intellectual, mentally strong man, and to ignore an aspect of your masculinity is going to result in you not being able to be the man that God made you to be, and you're not going to be able to influence people towards the vision that you're trying to paint for people.
Mhm.
Um, so no, I agree, and so I mean, as far as that goes, I mean, so give us then practical. What do you on a daily basis? So for these men, go back to go back to the original statistics that I asked you about. You said about between 85 and 95% of men are, I mean, we can call it incapable of overcoming the sin that has them captured,
Mhm.
right? When I talked to my buddies about this, we kind of arrived at a number. It was 90% of men.
Mhm.
90% of men are not currently, well, we talked about over half not being aware that they are captured by a sin, and then we have another, 35 to 40% that are currently, they know something's wrong, their conscience is nagging at them, but they still can't overcome it. What what is the what is the vision, or what is the kind of the daily disciplines that these men need to be dedicating themselves to? Like if a man wants to get themselves on the path to being a man who can provide for a family, attract who can attract a woman, who can gain a woman that respects him. Um, there's so much of male respect that's tied up in love within a relationship. Because I think ultimately that's what men want. Men want to build themselves up into somebody that can attract a woman who respects them, that he can build a family with. Most
Mhm.
men, I believe, all want that.
Yeah.
So what can we do to to what is it that men can do on a daily basis? What are the disciplines they need to dedicate themselves to? What does
Sure.
that look like practically?
So there's five categories that I always talk about: the the spiritual, the intellectual, the emotional, the physical, and the professional. So the spiritual is the most important because it sets the tone and it sets the guidelines for everything else that you do in all the other categories. So developing your relationship with God is essential. Um, and again, you're going to have, you are most likely going to have seasons with that relationship, but you have to be constantly pursuing it. And what constant pursuit means is that On an individual level, you're you are reading your Bible, you are praying. On a community level, you are seeking out friendships that of other men that are on a similar journey that can so you can hold each other accountable. That's the whole iron sharpens iron, right? You need people to be able to hold you accountable along that journey, and you need to be able to look for mentorship of people that you feel have are doing a good job of it, doing a good job of it. Now, one thing I always caution people in the mentorship, you never know what somebody's secret struggles might be. So it is fine to have mentors, right? Paul says this where he says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. But you never put the mentor on the pedestal that belongs only to God. Mentors will let you down at times. And it doesn't mean that everything the mentor ever did or taught you was a false or a lie or whatnot. That's the problem when people elevate mentors to the position of God. So God always remains on the throne, right? God always remains first. You know, that's the whole First Peter 3:15. First, sanctify Christ in your heart. So do that first, and then seek other men that are actually on that journey in order to form like important community bonds in order to be able to have, because who you surround yourself with has an enormous impact on the way you think about things. The next thing that you do on an individual level with respect to the spiritual side, and this again has an impact on the other side as well, is you be very, very careful on what you're taking in, what you're putting into your body. That could be visual, that could be audible, that could be food, that could be drink. But if you are allowing a bunch of intellectual garbage, emotional garbage, and garbage in the form of what you eat or what you drink or what you smoke or whatever, that is diminishing you as a person. That is diminishing you as a man. And I'm not I enjoy a good bourbon, right? I'm not saying you can't have a bourbon. I'm not saying you can't have a cigar. I'm just saying understand that you know the moment you allow vices to dominate you or control you, you are diminishing yourself as a man. Okay, so the spiritual component is your relationship with God. That is both an individual relationship between you and God, and then also setting the right mentors and the right accountability partners. And then once you reach a certain age, also mentoring others. This is another part that I think is very important that we don't necessarily talk about enough, is that once a man has attained a certain degree of experience in this world, you do have an obligation to help the younger men come along, to avoid the pits you fell into, to be able to provide guidance. And there is an aspect in embracing that responsibility that makes you better. That makes you better. That's one of the things that is true about men. Men are better when we have things that we're responsible for, because it helps us to address that need of feeling needed, but it also gives us something noble to pursue, and helps keep us within our boundaries and help temper our own passions, desires, and avoid temptation. Right? So
Mhm.
that's the spiritual. When it comes to the intellectual side, you should be intelligent. You should be smart. You should be well read. It has never been easier to do that. And so dedicate time on a daily basis to informing yourself. Um, and there are so many opportunities, whether it's on YouTube, whether it's on access to books or whatnot. We're living in a time where access to information has never been greater for both good or ill. So find people that you trust, um, and really make it a daily dedication to, I'm going to read something today, I'm going to learn something today, I'm going to watch something today, I'm going to listen to something today that's actually going to make me more intellectually capable. When it comes to the emotional, this has to do with controlling one's emotions. So throughout your day, whether it's at work, whether it's with family, whether it's with a girlfriend, maybe it's just with the frustrations with politics, what you should be asking yourself is every time that you have an emotional reaction, you shouldn't be closing yourself off to that. Um, by the same token, don't believe anybody that tells you that, oh, I want a man that's in touch with his feminine side. I want a man that's not afraid to cry. No, they don't. They want a man that is willing to show tenderness, and sometimes that tenderness will manifest itself in crying at the appropriate time. Nobody wants a blubbering man. Now, a lot of the ways that men deal with emotions in order to not be seen as vulnerable is to display the emotion of anger or outburst or whatnot, because if there's one thing we want to avoid, it's vulnerability, and I understand that. But what you should be looking at and what you should be looking to develop is throughout the day when you have a visceral reaction to something. Men tend to turn it into humor or anger. The proper thing to do, and there's an intellectual component to this as well, but on the emotional, the proper thing to do is properly assess the emotion and then keep it under control. Because if you can be the sort of man that has his emotions under control, that doesn't mean burying them. Emotion is an invitation to thought. If you feel a certain way about something, there's a reason for that. The next step in that process is to say, okay, why am I feeling this? Is it justified? What's the appropriate reaction? If you can be the sort of man that has his emotions under control, you will be the sort of man that is admired by both men and women. Promise you. Promise you. Get those emotions under control. The physical, get in shape, right? Get in shape. There's somebody asked me once, so like, what do you think? Andrew Tate once made a comment. It's like, if you think you got problems, go get a six pack and then see if you still got problems. Now, a lot of people say, well, that's flippant. Oh, how is getting a six pack going to cure my, childhood trauma? Right? The point is that when a man overcomes something or attains a degree of physical capability, it helps your confidence in other areas. So in fact, when we even say be a man, when somebody looks at you and says, you know what, be a man, it is almost intuitively understood by most men that when we hear someone say that to us, that what they mean is you need to be able to overcome physical discomfort, danger, or fear in order to keep your word and do your job. That's really hard to do if you're fat. I'm sorry. I know that sounds like insensitive. I realize that there's people that are dealing with either genuine issues where it's harder for them to control their weight. I'm not picking on anybody that has an issue with that is beyond their control. But the vast majority of people do not have an issue which is beyond their control. They have a discipline issue. And one of the easiest areas to be disciplined, or one of the most important areas to be disciplined, is in the physical. And part of the reason for that is that if you really want to be a man that is capable of protecting, that is capable of providing, that is capable of loving, and I mean that in the physical aspect with one's wife as well, being in shape contributes positively to all of those things. It is amazing how lifting weights is more and more associated now with cognitive ability. Jordan Peterson talks about this. If you want to continue to develop your cognitive ability, especially later in life, lifting weights is incredibly important for that. If you want to be able to beat cancer, the more muscle mass you have, the easier it is for your body to fight it off. So staying physically in shape is important to men for a variety of categories. Here's the other thing I will tell married men, because sometimes it gets easy when you get married and you're kind of comfortable and the whole deal to say like, hey, it's okay. I'm not saying anybody has to be a friggin' model. I'm not saying everybody has to be an Adonis. I'm not saying everybody has to be a UFC fighter. But you're the only dude your wife gets to see naked. How about you make sure she's excited about it, right? Like, is that too much for her to ask of you? No, it isn't. You'll feel better about yourself. So look, go to the gym and keep a regular gym schedule, and then be careful about what you put into your body as far as smoke, alcohol, foods, and whatnot. Again, you don't got to be you shouldn't be obsessing over it so much that you're to the detriment of other aspects of your life. But go to the gym, lift weights, and just be a little bit more careful about what you eat and drink, and you will be shocked at the advantages for that. And then finally, there's the professional. The professional has to do with the capabilities that you possess, which make you viable within the marketplace. That doesn't necessarily require a college degree, but it might, depending on what you want to do. But ultimately, the way people have this idea that if I work hard, I become wealthy. No, you are rewarded in the marketplace by the value of what you provide, not the intensity of labor associated with it. So what we raised our kids to do is I said, look, if you have a dream of something that you would really like to do, that's a wonderful thing and you should pursue it, provided that you understand that first and foremost, you have to be able to feed yourself. And something I really emphasize to my son is you have to be able to provide for a family, and you want to be able to provide for your family in such a way to where they can they can rely on your income. I'm not saying that other families that choose a different path are wrong or immoral. I'm just saying what I taught my son is you should be seeking professional capabilities sufficient to take care of your wife and children to where your wife doesn't have to work outside the home if she doesn't want to. Okay? So, how do you develop those capabilities? Well, again, it's never been easier, but the thing people need to look at is stop putting the degree on the pedestal. What you were rewarded for in the marketplace is a combination of your capabilities, your ability to actually get the job done, combined with your work ethic, which is your will to actually do it, the discipline associated with it. So, constantly looking at how I develop additional capabilities. If you would have told me that my primary source of income was going to be social media when I was 14, the first question I would have asked you is, what's social media? We didn't have it when I was 14. And so people have this mindset sometimes that I'm going to get a degree or I'm going to learn a trade, and then that's going to feed me my entire life. And if it doesn't, then something's wrong with society. No, no. What the marketplace is people going into an environment where they freely exchange property or services in exchange for other goods and services. That's what they do. So if you want to know how to be successful in the marketplace, you look around at what people want, you look around for what there is a demand of, and then you develop appropriate capabilities in those fields to meet a demand that you feel that you are uniquely or interested in developing and meeting. That's what you do. So constantly looking at like, how do I continue to develop things? Try to adopt it. Not everyone's an entrepreneur, but try to adopt some degree of an entrepreneurial mindset where you say, I'm going to develop core capabilities and skills that I know are marketable. Um, so those are the five. Your relationship with God under the spiritual and how that forms the foundation for the rest of your worldview. Each day, being determined and learning something that you think is valuable, that makes you more intellectually competent, that gives you the ability to better articulate what you believe, why you believe it, to be able to engage in conversation. An excellent tactic for that is just be inquisitive, just be curious, ask people questions about their lives and experiences. It can actually be a lot of fun.
Mhm.
Be emotional, just being aware of emotions that you feel throughout the day, and then asking yourself, stopping yourself at a particular moment and saying, what is the proper application of what I'm feeling at this particular moment? And how do I keep them under control? Not bury them, but keep them under control and then utilize them for something good. The physical workout, make it, you can get away if you work out if you lift weights 3 times a week, you're going to see positive results from that, right? But once again, never been easier, never been cheaper. Go on YouTube. There's plenty of people out there that will give you good guidance on how you can effectively work out. If you enjoy a sport, I think learning how to fight is a good thing to do. I did MMA with my son for a while. I've had to stop recently because I couldn't fit into my schedule. I need to be more disciplined about getting it back into my schedule because it's a great thing to learn how to do. And it provides a great deal of confidence, and it's physically demanding and useful. It's practical. And then on that professional, right? Constantly be developing those capabilities, constantly looking for ways that you can maximize the sort of things that you are not only you're not only there to be able to provide for yourself and your family, but be the sort of person that is also in a position to where when a friend is in need, they don't got to run to the government, right? You can help provide for that friend. You can help contribute to the things within society, to the people doing work that you think is valuable, to the sort of missionary or evangelical work that you want to be able to contribute, whether you want to physically participate in it or you want to help fund it, right? Being able to have the resources to be able to help other people is in and of itself a calling. We see this within Scripture, and so developing that professional capability, developing wealth is not anti-Christian. Loving wealth more than God or loving wealth more than your fellow, that is sinful. That's a violation of Scripture. But developing these resources and capabilities in order to be able to not only provide for yourself and your family, but to be able to help provide for others in times of need, or to be able to help them on their own journey, or to be able to invest in what they're doing. These are wonderful ways that you can actually contribute to mutual benefit. And so that's what I would say.
That's really good, Nick. And I think the only thing that I would want to add to that, because you got to all of those things, what exists within them are literally practical and obvious daily inputs that you need to execute day in and day out, right? So, with regard to the spiritual, did I pray today? Yes or no? Did I read the Bible today? Yes or no? With regard to intellectual, did I learn something from someone else today? Yes or no? And what was it? Write that down. Or Did I read 30 minutes of a book? Did I listen to a podcast and learn from somebody else today? Right. With regard to working out, did you get your workout in today? Yes or no? Right. So I've literally, for the last 10 years, I've been working off a daily checklist, and I evaluate myself on a daily basis. Honestly, within those 5 categories that you just mentioned. And by dedicating myself to that day in and day out, it has absolutely moved me from a boy, broke
Mhm.
boy, you wanted to use Andrew Tate language, broke boy, naive, whatever, into a man who is capable of leading and providing for a wife and kids and for a family, right? So 100% agree with you. I think that that's great. I think that's great advice. The last thing that I want to ask you here, and then we can wrap this up, is I think having a knowledge and an awareness of the enemy that's working against you is also very important, right? So, and understanding kind of the enemy's tactics. And if we're involved in spiritual warfare here, that's trying to destroy men, destroy families, destroy society. What are the things that in your opinion we should be most aware of? What should we as men be looking out for the most with regard to what's trying to knock us off the path from who God made us to be?
Um, well, and this is something where, again, there's times where I have like horrible imposter syndrome where it's like, oh, it's good advice, Nick. You should take it. um, Here's one thing I would encourage people to seriously consider, which I don't think is adequately considered in modern culture, because it almost seems kind of like woo-woo, right? And that is the spiritual warfare aspect. Now, for anybody that's watching this and maybe is not a Christian, here's what I would ask is nobody actually believes that the material is all that there is. Nobody actually believes that because nobody lives their life that way. Thought is not material. Love is not material. These aren't just all chemicals. Nobody actually believes that we're all just dancing exclusively to our DNA or chemicals. That may impact our decisions, but it doesn't have the ultimate say on it. Nobody lives like they believe that, even if they say they do. Right? Everyone believes that no, this love that I feel is genuine. Um, so we intuitively kind of understand that there's a spiritual aspect to existence. So if that's true, and let's just consider for a moment, maybe what the Bible is saying is true about the spiritual component here, that there is a battle going on that we don't see, but does have influence. It doesn't dictate what's going to happen in any individual decision, but it has influence. If you are willing to just intellectually consider that as a possibility, I would encourage you to read C.S. Lewis's book, The Screwtape Letters. Because C.S. Lewis, I think, did a better job of anyone that I've come into contact with on creating a way to understand how the spiritual aspect of reality works. Um, that isn't this Hollywood version of it. And it isn't this version of it, oh, the devil made me do it. No, that's not what's happening here. It's more about understanding how little things within your life, those ideas that pop into your head, those temptations that come about, how that can be part of a larger narrative that is taking place, part of a larger battle that is going on. And the better you understand it, the better you're going to be able to identify what the true nature of a problem is. And the better you're going to be able to seek out actual solutions to it, as opposed to just band-aids or little remedies that don't actually solve the underlying problem. Um, so I think to give any advice on how to properly kind of understand the spiritual component of reality requires you to actually dig in and understand what that actually means. Because again, Hollywood has done a disservice. There's a lot of people within the church that I think have done a horrible disservice to it by treating it almost as like a show,
Mhm.
uh, as opposed to something that is really serious and important to understand. And here's the part that I think blows people's minds, makes a lot of sense. Right? People think that you're just coming up with this, quasi, metaphysical, spiritual answer to something that is actually a rather simple solution. Well, some people might do that, right? If you hit your thumb with a hammer, chances are it wasn't the devil that made you do it. You just weren't paying attention.
Mhm.
But when you're dealing with certain thoughts or ideas or temptations or things like that, I think what you'll come to understand once you realize that yes, there is a God, yes, there is objective morality and truth, that the spiritual actually makes sense. And so rather than feel weird about it, just seriously consider it.
Mhm.
And then read a book like Screw Tape Letters along with Scripture, because Scripture is authoritative, right? Screw Tape Letters may be helpful, but Scripture is authoritative. Um, but read something like Screw Tape Letters that maybe gives you a way to kind of think about this in a way that you never considered before, and that will allow you to capture thoughts and when they first enter and be like, whoa, okay, where did that come from? Where did that come from? What are the implications of that? And how do I properly deal with it? How do I properly categorize it, assess it, and then know what is the biblical approach to confronting that idea or that concept? The other thing this will help you with tremendously is recognizing that other flesh and blood human beings are not ultimately your enemy. Now, I say this as a combat veteran, right? There were people that I had to contend with that were very much my enemy in the practical sense in that moment. But I don't look at other people made in the image of God as ultimately like that's my mortal enemy. They are struggling with things, and some of them may have given into temptations or given into a particular way of viewing the world that causes me to have to contend with them here in this physical world as well. Not taken away from that. Um, but the moment you start to see other people as made in the image of God and the children of God that He desperately wants a relationship and wants reconciliation with, it will afford you the proper kind of empathy within your life, which doesn't excuse sin, which doesn't excuse inappropriate or hurtful or wrong behavior, but still has an element of compassion for that person that desperately is struggling with the same sin you're struggling with, but being consumed by it in different ways and wants reconciliation. Um, because again, one of the most uplifting elements of Scripture is the idea that God loves us so much that He was willing to endure incredible injustice in order to maintain love the way it's properly meant to be understood, in order to reconcile ourselves with Him, all while maintaining justice in the process. That's so important. Um, so I think when we properly understand all of that, anyway, I kind of wove a line there, but
No,
that's the
that's
best
good.
I
And
could.
I think that the awareness of the internal stirrings that we have within ourselves, I think is critically important when you are trying to form yourself again. And if we're speaking specifically to men, but we're talking about everybody. If you're trying to form yourself into a person of virtue and character, right? So the Screw Tape Letters did a great job of that for me, and what also did a really good job of that for me is the spiritual exercises by Ignatius of Loyola. So um, he kind of goes through, but just to give the first two, which I think are very good and relevant and helpful for people to understand, is that the way that the enemy operates within our lives is that if we are going from what he calls sin to sin, then what the enemy does is he tries to make us feel comfortable in that. He tries to encourage us. So he tries to get us to feel as though we're continuing on and doing the right thing. So we may not feel um well, he uses the example of the enemy making us feel good and comforting us in a life where we're going from sin to sin. But then he uses the good spirit, which is the spirit of God, which is that voice of conscience within us. That's the one that bites and pokes us and disturbs us as we travel along that path of sin, right? So if you're living a sinful life and you feel those bites and pokes, that's likely God trying to pull you back towards
Yeah.
him. The enemy,
I,
though, is trying to make you feel good and justified and make excuses within that life.
yeah.
Here's the interesting thing, though, is that once you flip and once you dedicate yourself to living a life that is um, void of sin, so once you start to strive along the path where you're avoiding the near occasion of sin, then the enemy, so the roles reverse. So God will, or the good spirit will encourage you and give you consolation, hopefully along the way, even in times of desolation. But on the other hand, the enemy will bite and poke and disturb and confuse, like all of those thoughts that come in of doubt and worry and all of those
Yeah.
things when you're striving along and living a life of virtue. And I think that's just important to understand, because it's like, okay, when you dedicate yourself to being the best version of yourself, especially as a man, what we're talking about here, you're dedicating yourself to praying every day, exercising every day. It's like, be aware that the enemy is going to operate within you internally and try to knock you off that path. He doesn't want you to pray every day. He doesn't want you
Yeah.
to exercise every day. He doesn't want you learning from other people every day. He wants you isolated. He wants you locked in, and he wants you to continue along that life of sin. So, I mean, again, like you kind of got me thinking of all those things as you were going through that, but
Yeah.
it's that internal battle within each and every one of us that I feel like is so critical. But the
Yeah.
cool thing about, like, our Christian tradition has so many examples and so many ways and so many tools to use to help you along that path and along that journey.
Yeah. The other one thing I'll say is just two things real quick. My pastor said something the other day, which my daughter told me about because I had actually missed the sermon. She goes, the pastor said something interesting. He goes, every time you agree to a sin, you're essentially agreeing with a demon on what's right or wrong in that particular moment. I was like, ooh, wow. Okay, yeah, that's a powerful
Yeah,
visualization.
that's
The other thing
powerful.
I heard somebody say the other day that I thought was really, really insightful on kind of like a practical level, he goes, it's far easier to avoid temptation than it is to fight it. It's
Hmm.
like, you know what,
Hmm.
that is a very smart thing. And it goes to your point too about also surrounding yourself with people, um, that are on the same track as you. Because if you're constantly putting yourselves into situations where you have to fight temptation, you are setting yourself up for failure. So avoid it,
Right.
right? Like just avoid certain areas or circumstances. You can't avoid all of them, right? But you can set boundaries for yourself that will significantly minimize the degree of temptation that you're going to have to confront. And again, that's where, when Joseph was dealing with Potiphar's wife, um, he didn't sit there in the same room and discuss it out. He fled, right? He
Hmm.
fled temptation. And so I think that's important to remember too. But yeah,
Yeah, and it's important to remember that the people that you surround yourself with, if you are, again, if you're surrounding yourself with men or with friends, or or if you're following mentors that are constantly giving in to temptation or giving in to their vices, then you have to understand that you are then risking yourself also doing the same thing, right? So it's like, the guys that I need counsel from, like when I'm going through periods of struggle, are not the guys that are going out and drinking every weekend, or gambling fantasy football on a consistent basis. Like, those are not necessarily the men that I need to be going to if I am in need of some support, as a man, right? Like, you have to
yeah,
be aware of those things. You have to be careful with regard to who you're reaching out to for support and who you have in your inner circle.
yeah, absolutely.
So, well, Nick, I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today. Let people know where they can find you, and I'll also provide links and everything down in the description of this video.
Well, Zach, it's been a pleasure. Thanks again. I mean, people can find me, Nick J. Freitas, on all my social media platforms. We also have a show called Making the Argument that we do every Tuesday and Thursday. We have another show called The Y Minutes, which publishes every Wednesday. That's both on YouTube. And then we also have our own community there as well. We talk a lot about intentional community. A lot of what we've discussed today has been how do we find people who are like-minded, who are on similar journeys, similar values, and how do we constantly work to make each other better, to hold each other accountable, and to provide not only an online community, but also for people to kind of find their people also within their community. So, yeah, Nick J. Freitas, Making the Argument, the Y Minutes, those are all great places to find and follow us.
Okay, great. Thank you, Nick.
Thanks, Zach.